Imagine if history were a grand instruction manual for humanity, full of footnotes and, of course, a few typos. Well, over the centuries, kings, explorers, and scientists have made decisions so disastrous that they seem straight out of a comedy of errors. But in their case, the consequences were real. Lost wars, shaken empires, and even accidental discoveries that changed the course of the world. Today we're going to talk about just that. Historical events that sound like massive blunders, monumental gaffes, but that ended up shaping our civilization. And I'll say it up front, some of these stories are so absurd that you'll think, no way that actually happened. To start, imagine being in the 19th century, on an elegant ship heading to the Americas. The sea seems calm, but suddenly, fire. Yes, fire at sea. Not because the ship caught fire, but because the ocean itself was burning. This really happened on Lake Erie in the United States, the result of so much pollution and neglect that the water became flammable. It sounds exaggerated, but it was a collective mistake over decades that made worldwide headlines. And the most curious part, that error was the spark for the modern environmental movement. In other words, a disaster no one wanted ended up being the trigger to protect nature. Now, if a lake on fire already sounds unbelievable, wait until you hear about other historical blunders that are even more insane. Tell me, had you ever heard of the day the sea caught fire? If the sea catching fire already seems like something out of a movie, our next story is worthy of a Greek tragedy script. Except it really happened. We're talking about the famous Charge of the Light Brigade in 1854 during the Crimean War. Picture the scene. More than 600 British cavalrymen received the order to attack. But there was one small detail. They marched in the wrong direction. The result? They charged straight into the enemy's crossfire, as if they'd accidentally chosen the hardest level of a video game. The attack lasted less than 20 minutes, but it left hundreds dead and wounded. A communication error, a poorly transmitted order, and boom. It became one of the most embarrassing episodes in military history. In fact, the phrase Charge of the Light Brigade is still synonymous with a disaster foretold. The strangest part is that, despite the humiliating defeat, the survivors were celebrated as heroes. Their courage became inspiration for poems, songs, and even movies. It's as if the mistake was forgotten, but the bravery turned into legend. Now think about it. How many times in life do we make a decision without all the information and end up heading straight into the enemy camp? Well, this historical error is almost a metaphor for real life. And speaking of mistakes that changed entire destinies, wait until you hear about a financial decision that cost a gigantic chunk of the planet. Would you risk a guess on what it was? If losing a battle is already painful, imagine losing half a continent for a price that today wouldn't even buy a football stadium? Well, that's exactly what happened in 1867 when Russia decided to sell Alaska to the United States. The price? $7.2 million. Sounds like a lot? Not really. Converted, it's something like 2 cents per acre of land. At the time, many called the deal the dumbest purchase in American history. Secretary of State William Seward, who handled the negotiation, was even ridiculed. They said he'd bought a huge, useless block of ice. But the irony came soon after. What seemed like a frozen tundra hid unimaginable riches: gold, oil, and natural gas. Alaska turned into one of the world's most strategic and lucrative regions. In other words, a miscalculation by Russia that, unintentionally, gave the United States a geopolitical and economic treasure. Imagine. It's like someone selling a plot of land thinking it was just weeds, but underneath it was sitting on a diamond mine. And all that for a symbolic price. Now, the question that won't go away: if the Russians had known about Alaska's riches, do you think they would have given up that land? And since we're talking about disastrous negotiations, the next one involves a horse and an entire empire put at risk because of an absurd bet. If selling a valuable piece of land already seems like a huge blunder, wait until you hear the story of a horse that nearly cost an empire. Yes, a simple horse. We're in 18th century France, and the protagonist is Louis XIII, known for his passion for betting and games. It's said that on a day of extravagance, the king bet on a horse race, but not just any race. He allegedly offered nothing less than an entire territory from the French colonies in Canada as collateral. The result? A lost bet, and a gigantic chunk of the map practically handed over on a platter to the rival British. Of course, historians still debate the truth of this version, but the fact is that due to a series of thoughtless decisions, France really lost huge portions of its colonies in North America. And it wasn't just from inevitable military defeats, but in part from a lack of foresight and the habit of underestimating the strategic value of overseas lands. The most curious thing is to think how seemingly small decisions, a bet here, a signature there, shaped the map we know today. Imagine if France had kept control of Canada. Maybe English wouldn't be the dominant language in North America. It's like that saying, "For want of a nail, the kingdom was lost." In this case, for want of a horse, a part of the continent was lost. Now, if you thought that story was surreal, wait until you hear about the day a simple calendar error made a country lose. 11 days of life. Have you ever imagined waking up and discovering you'd lost 11 days of your life? Well, that's exactly what happened in England in 1752, when the country decided to adopt the Gregorian calendar. Up until then, the English used the Julian calendar, which was out of sync with the Earth's actual movement. The result? The seasons were falling out of alignment. To fix it, they had to jump straight from September 2nd to September 14th. Just like that, 11 days vanished from the calendar. The most curious part is that the population wasn't happy at all. Many believed they'd been robbed, as if their days of life had been stolen by force. There were protests in the streets, angry people shouting, "Give us back our 11 days," as if it were possible to reclaim lost time. Of course, the change was necessary. Without it, the day count would have gotten more and more confusing. But for those who lived through it, it was a huge shock. Imagine marking your own birthday and discovering that, officially, it wouldn't exist that year. That loss of days became one of the weirdest stories in world chronology. And it shows how even time, something we consider absolute, has been the cause of confusion and miscalculations. Now, if skipping 11 days already seems surreal, what about a battle fought after the war had already ended? Imagine fighting to the death without knowing the war had already ended. Well, that's exactly what happened in the famous Battle of New Orleans in 1815. The War of 1812 between the United States and the United Kingdom had already officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. But there was one detail. The news took weeks to cross the Atlantic. The result? The soldiers in New Orleans still believed they were in the midst of war. And so thousands of men charged into the battlefield, facing cannons, muskets, and bayonets, all for a war that no longer existed. To make matters worse, the fight was bloody. Hundreds dead and wounded in a completely pointless conflict. It's like entering a soccer match, giving it your all, sweating through your shirt, and then finding out at the end that the championship had ended months ago. The difference is that here, the price paid was in human lives. The most impressive part is that even though it was a battle without purpose, the American victory in New Orleans ended up fueling national pride. Andrew Jackson, who led the troops, became a hero and later even President of the United States. A communication error, a delay in the mail, and boom, a legend was born. And if you think fighting a war after it's over is already bizarre, wait until you hear about the time a simple math error nearly destroyed an entire city. You've probably heard that math doesn't lie, but what happens when someone messes up the calculation? Well, in 1999, NASA learned this the hard way. The case became famous as the metric system error. The American agency was about to receive data from a probe sent to study Mars, the Mars Climate Orbiter. Everything seemed perfect. Millions of dollars invested, years of work by engineers and scientists, until, when calculating the spacecraft's entry into Martian orbit, something went terribly wrong. And do you know what the cause was? While one team used the measurement system in pounds and feet, the so-called imperial system, the other used the metric system in kilograms and meters. The result was monumental confusion. The spacecraft entered the wrong orbit, got too close to the planet, and ended up disintegrating in the Martian atmosphere. In other words, A unit conversion error made NASA lose a mission valued at over $120 million. It's like ordering a giant pizza, paying a fortune for it, and then discovering at delivery that the delivery guy took the order to another planet. The case became one of the biggest lessons in the history of space exploration. Even the smallest details, like a simple calculation, can decide the fate of an entire mission. Now, if losing a probe due to a calculation error is already shocking, wait until you hear about the day soldiers mistook a military exercise for a real invasion. Imagine being in a routine military exercise and suddenly realizing that everyone believes World War III has started. It sounds like a joke, but that's exactly what happened in 1983 in the episode known as the Able Archer exercise. NATO was organizing maneuvers simulating a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. Up to that point, all good. The problem was that the Soviets, tense in the midst of the Cold War, believed it wasn't just a drill, but rather the real preparation for an attack. Radars and intelligence services went on maximum alert. There were orders to put nuclear missiles on standby. In other words, the world was just a few steps away from global catastrophe, all because of a misunderstanding. It's like you're playing pretend war, and the neighbor, not understanding a thing, decides to pull out a real bazooka. The scariest part is thinking that this misinterpretation could have completely changed the course of history. If someone had pressed the red button, we might be telling this story today under radioactive rubble, or maybe we wouldn't even be here to tell it. In the end, the episode served as a warning. Communication between the superpowers needed to improve. And it showed that sometimes the error isn't in an isolated decision, but in the simple act of misinterpreting the other side's intentions. And since we're talking about dangerous misunderstandings, how about remembering the day an entire library, and with it centuries of knowledge, turned to ashes due to carelessness? If losing a battle by mistake already sounds absurd, imagine losing an entire library, and with it, centuries of accumulated knowledge. Well, that's what happened to the legendary Library of Alexandria. Located in ancient Egypt, it was considered the greatest center of knowledge in the world. It's estimated to have held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, containing everything from scientific treatises to literary works from civilizations that no longer exist. It was like the Internet of Antiquity, but made of papyrus. And what happened? A moment of carelessness, one error after another, and fire did the rest. The first major fire is attributed to Julius Caesar's campaigns, when ships anchored in the port were set ablaze and the flames spread to the library. After that, new episodes of destruction, sometimes from invasions, sometimes from neglect, finished off what was left. The result? One of the greatest cultural losses in human history. We'll never know how many secrets, theories, and discoveries were lost there forever. It's like someone hit delete on half of the ancient knowledge on Earth. And the most curious thing is to think, if that library had survived, would our civilization have advanced centuries ahead? Would we have invented airplanes or computers much earlier? That question still echoes today. Now, to close our list of great historical mistakes, let's go to an episode where a simple forgotten detail made one of the world's largest ships sink on its maiden voyage. You've probably heard of the Titanic, the ship that sank on its inaugural voyage in 1912. But what you might not know is that beyond the iceberg, a sequence of human errors contributed to turning that tragedy into one of the most famous in history. The first error was overconfidence. The Titanic was called unsinkable, and because of that, those responsible didn't bother to provide enough lifeboats. The result? More than half the passengers didn't even have a chance to escape. Another shocking detail. Reports say the ship's lookout didn't have binoculars at the moment the iceberg was spotted. Believe it or not, the equipment was locked in a cabinet, and the key had been left with an officer who didn't board. If that doesn't sound like monumental carelessness, I don't know what does. When the iceberg was sighted, it was too late. The ship collided, tore open in steel gashes, and sank in less than 3 hours. More than 1,500 people lost their lives that freezing night. It's like fate aligned all possible small errors to ensure the tragedy. And the most impressive thing is that, even a century later, we still look at the Titanic as the greatest symbol of human hubris turned into disaster. Now tell me, which of these great historical mistakes surprised you the most? Share in the comments, give it a like if you enjoyed this dive into history, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next curiosities that'll make you think, did that really happen?